I'm Hannah Mitchell, 52, and for 29 years I've carried the weight of losing my husband James in the Oklahoma City bombing. He was just 34, working as a federal safety inspector on the 9th floor of the Murrah Building, when Timothy McVeigh truck bomb tore through our lives on April 19, 1995. I spent 3 decades honoring his memory, fighting for victims' families, and believing in the system he died serving. But last month, at a town hall meeting about new federal safety regulations, the very cause James died for, a city councilman looked me straight in the eye and called me anti-government for questioning a policy. The irony was suffocating. But what happened next would reveal a conspiracy that goes deeper than I ever imagined, and forces me to question everything I thought I knew about that terrible day. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt betrayed by the very institutions you trusted most, like this video. I still remember every detail of that morning, April 19, 1995. The sun was shining through our kitchen window as James kissed me goodbye, his coffee mug still warm on the counter. He was running late, which wasn't like him. James was methodical about everything. His work as a federal safety inspector demanded precision, and he brought that same careful attention to every aspect of his life. I need to finish that report on the construction site violations, he'd said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. Some of these contractors think they can cut corners on worker safety. Not on my watch. That was James, always protecting people, even when they didn't know they needed protecting. His briefcase was heavier than usual that morning, stuffed with documentation he'd been gathering for weeks. He'd been working late nights, poring over safety violations, and building code infractions that kept him awake with worry. The last thing he said to me was a promise to call during his lunch break. Instead, I have his final voicemail, left at 8:47 a.m. from his office on the 9th floor of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. His voice sounds tired but determined as he talks about the safety violations he's uncovered, the companies that need to be held accountable. Hannah, honey, I'm going to be late tonight again. This case is bigger than I thought. These construction companies are putting workers at risk, and I can't let that slide. I love you. I'll make it up to you this weekend, I promise. I was in my 3rd grade classroom when the world exploded, 23 miles away, teaching multiplication tables to 8-year-olds, when the building shook and the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. There's been an explosion downtown. If you have family working in federal buildings, please see me immediately. My legs went numb. I knew, before anyone said the words, before the news reports, before the Kasai knew, James was gone. A wife knows, 23 miles away. I felt the moment his heart stopped beating. The drive downtown was a nightmare of sirens and smoke. Police barriers blocked the streets, but I abandoned my car and ran. The Murrah Building, what was left of it, like a giant had taken a bite out of it. The entire north face was gone, floors pancaked into each other, and dust covered everything like gray snow. I stood there screaming his name until my voice was raw, until a paramedic wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and led me to a triage area where other families waited for news that would never come. The rescue workers were heroes, crawling through the rubble for days, but some people like James on the 9th floor were beyond saving. 168 people died that day, including 19 children in the daycare center. James was body number 127, identified by his wedding ring and a safety inspector badge that somehow survived the blast. His briefcase was found 3 blocks away, scattered papers still legible, still documenting the violations he'd never get to prosecute. The funeral was a media circus. James would have hated it. All those cameras, politicians giving speeches about heroes and sacrifice while never having met him. President Clinton came, Governor Keating spoke, and suddenly my husband became a symbol instead of a man who left his coffee cup on the kitchen counter that last morning. But in James's briefcase, rescued from the rubble, I found something that changed everything. His unfinished safety report, pages of meticulous documentation about construction companies cutting corners, putting workers at risk to save money. His handwriting filled the margins with notes. Incomplete safety rails. 3rd incident this month. Foreman ignored fall protection protocols. Companies saved $50,000 by skipping safety measures. This wasn't just paperwork to James. Each violation represented a worker who might not go home to their family, a spouse who might get the call I got, Standing at his graveside, surrounded by hundreds of mourners and news cameras, I made a promise that would define the next 29 years of my life. James died protecting people, I said, my voice barely steady as I spoke to the crowd. He believed that everyone deserves to go home safe at the end of their workday. His work isn't finished, and neither am I. The other families understood. Sarah Williams, whose husband died in the D office on the 9th floor. Michael Chen, whose wife was a social worker on the 7th floor. We became a family bound by grief and determination, meeting in church basements and community centers, sharing our stories and our anger. Within 6 months, we'd formed the Oklahoma City Families for Federal Safety Reform. The name was unwieldy, but our mission was clear. No more families should lose someone to preventable workplace dangers. We lobbied for stricter enforcement of safety regulations, better funding for inspections, and real consequences for companies that put profit over people's lives. The work gave my grief purpose. Every safety violation we prevented, every worker who went home safe because of stronger regulations, that was James's legacy. The media called us the voices of the victims, and politicians listened because our pain was real and our cause was just. But even then, I noticed something. The further we pushed for real change, the more resistance we encountered. Not from the public they supported us, but from bureaucrats, who seemed more interested in appearances than results. James's unfinished report became my Bible, proof that he died trying to protect people from the very negligence we were fighting. I kept his safety inspector badge in my purse, a reminder of why this work mattered. James had been methodical, thorough, uncompromising when it came to safety. Now I had to be all those things too, for him and for all the families who shouldn't have to endure what we'd endured. By 1998, our grassroots advocacy group had evolved into something more substantial. The Mitchell Safety Foundation became official on the 3rd anniversary of the bombing, with legal documents that made our mission permanent, to ensure that federal workplace safety regulations are enforced with the diligence and integrity that James Mitchell exemplified in his service. The Foundation's charter, signed in a small ceremony attended by bombing families and safety advocates, represented everything James had believed in. We weren't anti-government, we wanted the system to work the way it was supposed to work, protecting workers instead of protecting corporate interests. Our first major victory came in 2001 when the Mitchell Workplace Safety Act passed Congress. The legislation, named after James, increased penalties for safety violations and required unannounced inspections of high-risk construction sites. I testified before Congress, holding up James's unfinished report as evidence of why this mattered. My husband died doing his job, I told the senators. He died believing that government exists to protect people, not to enable those who would harm them for profit. This legislation ensures that his death wasn't meaningless. The foundation grew. We hired staff, opened an office in downtown Oklahoma City, and became the go-to organization when workplace safety disasters made headlines. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon explosion, the 2013 West Fertilizer Company explosion. We were there, demanding accountability, pushing for stronger regulations, being the voice for workers who had no voice. By 2020, we'd helped pass 17 pieces of federal safety legislation and prevented countless workplace deaths through our advocacy. Politicians from both parties praised our work. The foundation had an annual budget of $2.3 million, funded by donations from families who understood our mission and foundations that supported workplace safety. I became a regular on congressional hearing schedules, testifying about safety regulations with the same methodical precision James had brought to his inspections. The Foundation's reports were cited in federal court cases and used by OSHA to justify enforcement actions. We were respected, effective, and completely committed to working within the system. That's what made the town hall incident so bewildering. After 29 years of working with federal agencies, supporting stronger government oversight, and believing that the system could be made to work for ordinary people, someone looked me in the eye and called me anti-government. The Foundation's charter hung framed in my office, signed by bombing families who trusted me to carry forward their loved ones' legacies. James's unfinished safety report sat in a place of honor on my desk, still inspiring our work nearly 3 decades later. Every day, I tried to be worthy of the trust they'd placed in me. Our success had made us powerful, and I was beginning to understand that power made some people nervous. The foundation didn't just advocate for safety, we had the credibility and resources to hold companies and agencies accountable when they failed. We'd become more than grieving families asking for change. We'd become a force that could actually create change. Looking back now, I realize that's when we became a threat. The Oklahoma City Municipal Building was packed that evening in March 2024. The City Council was debating new federal safety regulations for public construction projects, exactly the kind of oversight James had died trying to enforce. I'd attended dozens of these meetings over the years, usually sitting quietly unless asked to speak about the foundation's position. This time felt different from the moment I walked in. The usual friendly nods from council members were absent. Councilman Robert Hayes, whom I'd worked with on 3 previous safety initiatives, wouldn't make eye contact. The city attorney kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read. When they opened the floor for public comment, I approached the microphone with the same prepared remarks I'd given 100 times before. The new regulations were common sense, measures that would prevent workplace accidents. The foundation supported them completely. Nothing controversial, nothing that should have raised eyebrows. These safety requirements will save lives, I concluded, holding up a copy of James's unfinished report. My husband died documenting the kind of violations these regulations are designed to prevent. The Mitchell Safety Foundation strongly endorses Mrs. Mitchell, Councilman Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp. While we appreciate your perspective, the council has concerns about your organization's increasingly anti-government stance. The room went silent. Anti-government. I'd spent 29 years working within the system, supporting federal oversight, advocating for stronger government regulation of workplace safety. The foundation had endorsed every safety measure proposed by federal agencies for nearly 3 decades. I'm sorry, Councilman Hayes, but I don't understand. The foundation has always supported your recent statements questioning federal priorities, suggest a concerning shift in your organization's mission. He continued, consulting notes that hadn't been there when I'd spoken at previous meetings. The council questions whether groups with anti-government agendas should influence municipal policy decisions. My face burned. Around the room, people were pulling out phones, recording this exchange. Someone in the back shouted, "She lost her husband in the bombing." But Hayes pressed on, reading from prepared talking points that painted the foundation's legitimate policy questions as evidence of extremist thinking. The city attorney slid a folder across the table to Hayes. Inside, I glimpsed what looked like printouts of foundation documents, but with highlighting and annotations I didn't recognize. Our routine policy papers had somehow been reframed as evidence of anti-government sentiment. The foundation has always worked collaboratively with federal agencies, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We've supported every major workplace safety initiative for 29 years. I don't understand where this characterization is coming from. Your own documents speak for themselves, Mrs. Mitchell Hayes replied, waving the folder. The council will take your comments under advisement, but we must consider the source. I left the building in shock. Past reporters who'd somehow materialized to capture my reaction. Past neighbors who'd known me for decades and now looked at me with confusion. The foundation's administrative director, Patricia Wells, caught up with me in the parking lot. "Hannah, what just happened in there?" she asked. "Those weren't our documents. I write all our policy papers, and nothing we've ever published could be characterized as anti-government." That night, I watched the local news coverage of the meeting. The story focused on my confrontational appearance before the council, with my defense of federal safety regulations edited to sound like criticism of government overreach. The reporter described me as a bombing victim whose advocacy work has taken a more militant tone in recent years. Militant, anti-government, these words were being attached to my name, to James's memory, to 29 years of work supporting stronger government oversight. Someone had decided that Hannah Mitchell was no longer a grieving widow seeking justice, but a threat that needed to be neutralized. The official council meeting minutes, published the next day, described my comments as questioning federal authority and expressing anti-government sentiments. These minutes would become part of the public record, a permanent distortion of what had actually happened in that room. The humiliation of that town hall meeting burned for days. I'd been called many things over the years: persistent, stubborn, even obsessive about safety regulations, but never anti-government. The irony was suffocating. James had died serving the government, and I'd spent 29 years trying to make that government work better for ordinary people. I started my investigation, the way James would have, methodically, gathering evidence. Councilman Hayes had cited Foundation documents as proof of our anti-government stance, so I requested copies through the city's public records process. What I received made no sense. The documents were ours, position papers we'd published, testimony transcripts from congressional hearings, but they'd been annotated with highlighting and margin notes that completely changed their meaning. Our support for rigorous federal oversight was highlighted as evidence of government criticism. Our call for accountability in federal agencies was marked as anti-establishment rhetoric. Thought someone had weaponized our own words against us, taking statements supporting stronger government regulation and reframing them as attacks on government authority. It was brilliant in its deception and terrifying in its implications. I dug deeper into Hayes's background. 3 years ago, he'd been a reliable ally, supporting municipal safety initiatives and praising the Foundation's work. His transformations seemed to coincide with his appointment to the State Economic Development Committee, a position that put him in contact with construction industry lobbyists and corporate donors. That's when the first anonymous letter arrived. It was waiting in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, no return address, postmarked locally. Inside, a single typed page with a message that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Mitchell, you're asking the right questions about the wrong people. Your husband's death was about more than workplace safety. Some secrets are worth killing for. Stop digging, or join him. My hands shook as I read it again. The letter was designed to intimidate, but it also revealed something important. Someone was watching my investigation closely enough to know I was investigating. That meant I was on the right track. I started reaching out to other victim advocates, people I'd worked with over the years. The conversations were disturbing. Sarah Williams, whose husband died in the DI office, had been mysteriously dismissed from a federal safety conference where she'd been scheduled to speak. Michael Chen reported that his wife's pension benefits were suddenly under review by federal administrators. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Victim advocates who'd been effective for decades were suddenly facing bureaucratic obstacles, public questioning of their motives, and systematic attempts to undermine their credibility. We weren't just being silenced, we were being discredited. The Foundation's phones started ringing with reporters asking about our radical agenda and anti-government activities. These weren't legitimate journalists following a story. They were fishing for quotes that could be taken out of context to support a predetermined narrative. I realized we were under attack, but I didn't yet understand why. What had changed? What made victim advocates like us suddenly threatening after decades of working within the system? The anonymous letter suggested it had something to do with James's death, with secrets worth killing for. That night, I pulled out James's unfinished safety report and read it again with new eyes, looking for clues I might have missed. What had my husband uncovered that someone still wanted buried nearly 30 years later? The anonymous letter consumed my thoughts for days. Someone was watching me closely enough to know I was investigating the town hall incident, which meant my phones might be tapped, my emails monitored. I felt paranoid thinking it, but the evidence was mounting that victim advocates were under some kind of systematic surveillance. I decided to test my theory. Using the Freedom of Information Act, I requested any federal files related to the Mitchell Safety Foundation. What came back 3 weeks later was a stack of heavily redacted documents that confirmed my worst fears. The FBI field office in Oklahoma City had been monitoring the Foundation's activities for over a decade. Phone records, financial transactions, meeting attendees, all documented in meticulous detail. The justification cited potential domestic security concerns and monitoring of anti-government sentiment among victim advocate groups. Anti-government sentiment. There was that phrase again, attached to people who'd spent decades supporting stronger government oversight and regulation. Someone had decided that effective advocacy was the same as sedition, that holding government accountable was evidence of being anti-government. The surveillance files revealed the scope of what we were facing. Not just the Mitchell Foundation, but victim advocacy groups across the country were being monitored. The files contained cross-references to other investigations, other advocates who'd found themselves suddenly facing credibility attacks and bureaucratic obstacles. I called Patricia Wells, the Foundation's administrative director, and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop across town. I didn't trust our office phones anymore. Patricia, how long have you noticed increased scrutiny of our work? I asked, sliding a copy of the redacted FBI files across the table. Her face went pale as she read. Hannah, this explains so much. The sudden audits of our tax-exempt status, the requests for donor information, the reporters asking about our real agenda. They've been building a case against us. But a case for what? We support government regulation. We work with federal agencies. Everything we do is public record. That's exactly the problem, Patricia said, understanding dawning in her eyes. We're effective. The foundation has real influence over safety policy. We can mobilize victim families, generate media coverage, and pressure politicians to take action. That makes us powerful, and power makes us dangerous. The surveillance wasn't random harassment, it was strategic. Someone needed victim advocates to be discredited before we could interfere with some larger agenda. The question was, what agenda? I spent the next week reaching out to advocates in other states, using encrypted email and prepaid phones. The stories were remarkably similar. Effective advocacy groups suddenly facing IRS investigations, media campaigns questioning their legitimacy, and bureaucratic obstacles that made their work nearly impossible. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, whose daughter died in a chemical plant explosion in Texas, had been advocating for stricter industrial safety regulations for 15 years. Last month, local news ran a story questioning her extremist connections and suggesting her advocacy work was a cover for anti-corporate terrorism. Robert Chen, whose son died in a mine collapse in West Virginia, found his Mine Safety Foundation's federal grants suddenly under review for compliance issues that had never existed before. The pattern was national in scope and remarkably coordinated. Victim advocates who'd been heroes were suddenly being reframed as threats. Our credibility was being systematically destroyed, our influence neutralized. But why now? What had changed that made us suddenly dangerous after decades of working within the system? The answer came in an email from Sarah Williams, sent from a library computer. Hannah, check the news about the Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act. It's moving through Congress quietly, with almost no media coverage. If it passes, it would gut most of the regulations we fought for. I looked up the legislation that night. Buried in a massive spending bill was language that would eliminate mandatory safety inspections, reduce penalties for violations, and transfer enforcement authority from federal agencies to state regulators who were much easier for corporations to influence. Everything James had died for, everything we'd fought for 29 years to achieve, was about to be quietly eliminated. And victim advocates, the people with the credibility and platform to oppose it, were being systematically silenced before we could sound the alarm. Marcus Weber contacted me through an encrypted messaging app, using a mutual connection from the Oklahoma City Bombing Survivors Network. He was an investigative journalist with the Washington Tribune, and he'd been following a story that intersected with my experience in ways I couldn't have imagined. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been investigating coordinated attacks on government watchdog groups, he said when we met at a diner outside Oklahoma City. Your foundation is part of a much larger pattern. Marcus was in his 40s. With the tired eyes of someone who'd spent years chasing stories that powerful people didn't want told. He carried a worn leather satchel filled with handwritten notes. Digital devices, he explained, because his investigation had attracted unwanted attention. 3 months ago, a source leaked documents showing that a network of corporate-funded organizations has been systematically targeting effective advocacy groups, he said, pulling out a notebook filled with his careful handwriting. They identify groups that have real influence over policy, then launch coordinated campaigns to destroy their credibility. Marcus's notes were meticulous, documenting connections between think tanks, public relations firms, and corporate lobbyists. The strategy was sophisticated. Instead of opposing advocacy groups directly, they reframed effective advocates as extremists, using their own words against them and manufacturing evidence of anti-government sentiment. The goal isn't to debate policy, Marcus explained. It's to eliminate the advocates before the debate can happen. If victim families and watchdog groups have no credibility, then corporate interests can reshape regulations without public opposition. He showed me research on dozens of advocacy groups that had faced similar attacks. Environmental organizations labeled as eco-terrorists, consumer safety groups characterized as anti-business extremists, civil rights organizations accused of reverse racism. The tactics were identical to what I'd experienced. Take legitimate advocacy work and reframe it as evidence of dangerous radicalism. Your foundation was particularly threatening because of your credibility, Marcus said. Bauman, victims advocating for safety regulations have moral authority. That's hard to attack directly, so they had to attack your character instead. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. Marcus had traced funding from major corporations through a maze of shell organizations and nonprofit groups, all designed to obscure the original source of the money. The same corporations that benefited from weakened safety regulations were funding the campaigns to discredit the advocates who opposed them. "I've been working on this story for 8 months, Marcus said, his voice dropping. "My editor killed it twice, claiming insufficient evidence. Then I started getting calls from corporate lawyers suggesting I was pursuing a defamatory conspiracy theory. Marcus's investigation had put him in the same position as the advocates he was researching. His credibility was being questioned, his motives challenged, his career threatened. The machine that destroyed advocacy groups was now targeting the journalists trying to expose it. That's when I realized I needed to work with the advocates directly," he said. "The story can't be told from the outside. It has to be told by the people who've lived it." Marcus had been collecting evidence for months, but he needed someone with the courage to go public, despite the personal cost. Someone with enough credibility that the attacks couldn't completely destroy their reputation. Someone who understood that remaining silent meant letting the attackers win. "Mrs. Mitchell, your foundation has been fighting for safety regulations for 29 years. You've seen how the system is supposed to work, and now you're seeing how it actually works when corporate interests are threatened. Are you willing to help me expose this?" I thought about James's unfinished safety report, about the promise I'd made at his funeral, about the foundation's charter hanging in my office. I'd spent 3 decades believing that the system could be reformed from within, that persistent advocacy could create lasting change. Now I understood that the system itself was under attack, and that victim advocates like me weren't just obstacles to corporate interests. We were enemies to be destroyed. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. Bafta smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Help me prove that this conspiracy isn't a theory. Help me show people what's really happening to the advocates who try to hold power accountable." That night, I went through Marcus's notes again, cross-referencing his research with my own experience. The patterns were undeniable, the connections clear, but I also understood that going public would make me an even bigger target, that speaking truth about this conspiracy would invite retaliation that could destroy everything James and I had built. The question wasn't whether I could afford to speak up. The question was whether I could afford to stay silent. Working with Marcus Weber opened my eyes to the true scope of what we were fighting, what I'd experienced as isolated incidents, the town hall attack, the surveillance. The character assassination was actually part of a sophisticated network designed to neutralize effective advocacy groups across the country. Marcus had spent months tracing the money trail, and what he'd discovered was both impressive and terrifying. The attack on my foundation wasn't personal, it was business. Corporate interests had identified the Mitchell Foundation as a threat to their agenda and deployed proven tactics to eliminate that threat. "Look at this," Marcus said, spreading corporate funding documents across my kitchen table. We'd moved our meetings to my house after he noticed his car being followed. The American Enterprise Policy Institute received $2.3 million from chemical companies last year. The Freedom Foundation got $1.8 million from construction industry groups. Both organizations have published reports questioning the legitimacy of victim advocacy groups. The funding documents revealed a careful strategy. Instead of corporations directly attacking advocacy groups, they funded think tanks and policy organizations that would make the attacks for them. This created plausible deniability. The corporations could claim they weren't involved while their surrogates did the dirty work. The Institute for Responsible Governance published a report last month titled "When Grief Becomes Grievance: The Radicalization of Victim Advocacy." Marcus continued. 3 pages of that report are dedicated to questioning your foundation's increasingly militant stance. The Institute received $750,000 from companies that would benefit from the Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act. I read the report with growing anger. It used selective quotes from our congressional testimony, taken completely out of context, to paint the foundation as anti-government extremists. Our call for accountability in federal agencies became evidence of seditious thinking. Our criticism of regulatory capture by corporate interests was framed as conspiracy theorizing. The strategy was brilliant because it was subtle. The report didn't make obviously false claims, it simply reframed true statements to support false conclusions. Someone reading it without context would conclude that the Mitchell Foundation had indeed become radicalized, that our grief had transformed into dangerous political extremism. How many advocacy groups have they targeted this way? I asked. Marcus consulted his notes. At least 47 organizations in the past 2 years: environmental groups, consumer safety advocates, civil rights organizations, whistleblower protection groups, anyone with the credibility and platform to oppose corporate interests. The scope was staggering. An entire infrastructure had been created to identify and neutralize effective advocacy, to silence voices that might interfere with corporate profits. The fact that many targets were victim advocacy groups made the strategy even more cynical. They were literally profiting from tragedy by silencing the survivors. The timing isn't coincidental, Marcus explained. The Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act represents billions of dollars in potential savings for companies that currently have to comply with safety regulations. Eliminating the advocates who would oppose the legislation is a sound business investment. I thought about the other bombing families, the people who trusted me to represent their interests and honor their loved ones' memories. They had no idea that our foundation was under attack, that our credibility was being systematically destroyed to serve corporate interests. Marcus, we need to warn the other advocacy groups. If this network is targeting 47 organizations, most of them probably don't know what's happening to them. That's the genius of the strategy, he replied. Each group thinks they're facing isolated problems: a rogue journalist, a biased report, bureaucratic harassment. They don't realize it's coordinated until it's too late to respond effectively. That evening, I began reaching out to other targeted advocates, using the secure communication methods Marcus had taught me. The conversations were heartbreaking. Leaders of respected organizations were confused and demoralized, watching decades of credibility evaporate under mysterious attacks they couldn't understand or counter. Dr. Patricia Evans, who'd led a consumer safety organization for 20 years, was facing IRS audits and media scrutiny that made her work impossible. I don't understand what happened, Hannah. One day we were trusted experts testifying before Congress. The next day, we're being portrayed as anti-business radicals. The corporate funding documents explained what had happened. Dr. Evans's organization had been identified as a threat to pharmaceutical industry profits, so the network had deployed the same tactics used against my foundation. Think tank reports questioned her organization's credibility. Journalists wrote stories about their extremist agenda, and bureaucrats suddenly found reasons to investigate their activities. By the end of the week, Marcus and I had documented the systematic destruction of advocacy infrastructure across multiple industries. It wasn't just about safety regulations, this was about eliminating any organized opposition to corporate power. The question now, Marcus said, is whether we can expose this network before they succeed in destroying everyone who might oppose them. I looked at the corporate funding documents spread across my table. Evidence of a conspiracy so vast and cynical that most people would find it hard to believe. But I also thought about James's unfinished safety report, about the promise I'd made at his funeral, about the foundation's charter that committed us to fighting for accountability. The network had made one crucial miscalculation. They'd targeted someone who'd already lost everything that mattered most to her. I had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The leaked memo arrived in my email at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, sent from an anonymous account that disappeared within hours. The subject line read simply, "You need to see this." Attached was a classified document from the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Strategic Communications, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The memo's title made my blood run cold: Narrative, Management Protocols, Oklahoma City Bombing 30th Anniversary Commemoration. I read it 3 times before the full implications sank in. The document outlined a coordinated strategy to manage public messaging around the upcoming 30th anniversary of the bombing, with specific focus on containing anti-government sentiment among victim family members and advocacy organizations. The memo identified my foundation by name as a high-priority narrative risk, noting our established credibility among victim families and demonstrated ability to influence media coverage and policy discussions. We weren't just being monitored, we were being actively managed as a threat to official commemorative messaging. According to the memo, The anniversary would be used to reinforce themes of national unity, government service, and institutional resilience, while marginalizing voices that promote distrust of federal institutions or question official responses to domestic terrorism. The cynicism was breathtaking. They were planning to use James's death, and the deaths of 167 other innocent people, as a propaganda opportunity, while simultaneously silencing the families who might complicate their narrative. The memo detailed specific strategies for neutralizing problematic voices during anniversary coverage. Victim family members who supported government accountability would be excluded from official events. Media interviews would be limited to families who could be counted on to deliver approved messaging. Any criticism of government failures would be reframed as exploitation of tragedy for political purposes. My foundation was specifically flagged for having documented patterns of anti-government rhetoric disguised as safety advocacy. The memo recommended continued monitoring and strategic discrediting to ensure we couldn't contaminate anniversary messaging with divisive political content. I called Marcus immediately, my hands shaking as I held the phone. "They're not just attacking us to pass legislation," I told him. "They're preparing to weaponize the 30th anniversary of my husband's death. They want to use the bombing as propaganda while silencing the families who might tell inconvenient truths." Marcus arrived at my house within an hour. He read the memo, in silence, his face growing darker with each page. "Hannah, this changes everything," he said finally. "This isn't just corporate lobbying. This is government propaganda using a national tragedy. They're planning to turn the anniversary into a political weapon." The memo revealed that the attacks on advocacy groups weren't just about passing the Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act. They were about establishing a precedent that victim families could be silenced when their voices became inconvenient to official narratives. "Look at this section." Marcus pointed to a paragraph near the end of the memo. "They're planning to use the anniversary to justify increased surveillance of domestic extremist groups, including victim advocacy organizations that question government performance." The strategy was diabolical in its sophistication. The same families who'd lost loved ones to domestic terrorism were being reframed as potential domestic terrorists themselves, simply for holding government accountable to do better. I thought about the other bombing families, people who trusted me to represent their interests and honor their loved ones' memories. They had no idea that their grief was being weaponized against them, that their calls for accountability were being reframed as threats to national security. "The memo mentions asset protection protocols," I said, reading another section. "They're worried that victim advocates might reveal information that could compromise ongoing security operations or undermine public confidence in federal response capabilities." Marcus looked up from his notes. "What information could victim advocates reveal that would compromise security operations?" That question haunted me. What did we know, or what might we discover, that made us dangerous enough to warrant this level of surveillance and discrediting? The memo suggested that silencing victim advocates wasn't just about current policy debates, it was about protecting secrets from the past. I retrieved James's unfinished safety report from my desk, the document that had inspired 29 years of advocacy work. For the first time, I wondered if there was something in those pages that I'd missed, something that connected to current efforts to silence victim families. The report detailed construction companies' safety violations, but what if it documented something more? What if James had uncovered information that was still sensitive nearly 3 decades later? "Marcus, what if the attacks on victim advocates aren't just about future legislation? What if they're about preventing us from asking questions about the past?" He looked at me intently. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about what our loved ones might have discovered before they died. Questions about whether their deaths prevented them from exposing something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden." The leaked memo had revealed that the government saw victim families as a threat to official narratives. But what if those narratives were built on lies? What if the greatest threat we posed wasn't our advocacy for accountability, but our potential to uncover the truth about why accountability was so desperately needed? As I read the memo again, one phrase kept standing out: preventing exploitation of anniversary coverage to promote conspiracy theories or undermine official accounts of the incident. Official accounts of the incident. After 29 years, they were still worried about protecting the official account of what happened that day. The question was, what were they hiding, and how far would they go to keep it hidden? The leaked DHS memo changed everything. Within 48 hours of receiving it, I was contacted by victim advocates from across the country who'd received copies from the same anonymous source. We weren't isolated targets anymore. We were a network of survivors fighting back against a coordinated attack on our credibility and our truth. Dr. Patricia Evans called first. Hannah, I've been getting encrypted messages from advocates in 12 states. We're all facing the same tactics, the same timeline, the same strategy. Someone wanted us to see that memo. The encrypted communications revealed the scope of what we were facing. Sarah Williams in Oklahoma City, Michael Chen in West Virginia, Dr. Jennifer Martinez in Texas. All of us had been targeted by the same network, using identical methods, but now we were talking to each other, sharing information, and beginning to understand the full picture. The messaging app Marcus had introduced me to became our lifeline. Secure, encrypted, and designed for whistleblowers and journalists. It allowed us to communicate without fear of surveillance. The conversations were both heartbreaking and empowering. They've been monitoring my foundation's phone calls for 2 years, Dr. Martinez wrote from Texas. The surveillance files show they knew about our congressional testimony before we delivered it, our media strategy before we implemented it, our donor outreach before we made contact. Michael Chen shared similar experiences from West Virginia. The Mine Safety Foundation's board meeting minutes were somehow leaked to corporate lawyers before we'd even distributed them to board members. They knew our litigation strategy before we'd finalized it. The surveillance wasn't just monitoring, it was sabotage. By knowing our strategies in advance, the corporate network could prepare counter-strategies, plant negative stories, and undermine our effectiveness before we could act. We'd been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs for years without realizing it. But the memo had also revealed something crucial. They were afraid of us. The sophisticated surveillance and discrediting campaigns weren't just harassment, were desperate attempts to prevent us from uncovering something that could destroy the carefully constructed narratives protecting powerful interests. We need to meet in person, I wrote to the group. Somewhere they can't monitor, somewhere we can share everything we know without digital surveillance. Marcus arranged a meeting at a remote cabin in the Arkansas Ozarks, borrowed from a source who understood the need for absolute privacy. 12 of us made the trip, representing victim advocacy organizations from across the country. For the first time in months, we could speak freely without fear of being overheard. The stories we shared revealed a pattern of systematic intimidation that went far beyond what any of us had experienced individually. Dr. Evans's organization had faced IRS audits triggered by anonymous complaints. Michael Chen's foundation had been sued by shell companies funded by mining corporations. Dr. Martinez had received death threats that local police refused to investigate seriously. They're not just trying to discredit us, Dr. Evans observed. They're trying to bankrupt us, exhaust us, and terrorize us into silence. This is warfare. Sarah Williams had brought financial records showing how the attacks were coordinated with legislative calendars. Every time major safety legislation comes up for a vote, the attacks on victim advocates intensify. They're not random, they're strategic. But we also discovered something the attackers hadn't anticipated. Their systematic approach had created evidence of the conspiracy. The identical tactics, the coordinated timing, the shared funding sources, patterns that would be invisible to isolated victims but became obvious when we compared our experiences. We have proof now, Marcus said, reviewing the documentation we'd compiled. Not just suspicions or theories, but documented evidence of a coordinated campaign to silence victim advocates across multiple industries and multiple states. The question was, what to do with that proof? Going public would invite even more vicious retaliation, but staying silent would allow the attacks to continue. We were at a crossroads where our choice would determine not just our own futures, but the future of advocacy itself. They made one mistake, I told the group, as we prepared to leave. They assumed we'd stay isolated, that we'd never realize we were all fighting the same enemy. Now we know. Now we can fight back together. The encrypted communications continued after we returned home, but now they carried a different energy. We weren't victims anymore. We were resistance fighters. And we were planning our counterattack. The package arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered to my front porch with no return address or delivery service markings. Inside, I found something that made my blood freeze. Photographs of me going about my daily routine over the past 2 weeks. Hannah Mitchell entering the grocery store on Tuesday, March 12, 3:47 p.m. Hannah Mitchell at the gas station on Friday, March 15, 2:23 p.m. Hannah Mitchell leaving the foundation office on Monday, March 18, 6:15 p.m. Each photo was time-stamped and taken from distances that proved sophisticated surveillance equipment. But the most chilling photo was of me meeting Marcus at the diner outside town, clearly showing both our faces and the documents spread across the table. Someone had been watching us from the beginning, documenting our investigation with the patience and resources of a professional operation. A typed note accompanied the photos. Mrs. Mitchell, we know where you are every moment of every day. We know who you're talking to and what you're discussing. Your husband couldn't be protected, and neither can you. Stop now, while you still have a choice. I called Marcus immediately, my hands shaking as I held the phone. They've been photographing me for weeks, I told them. Professional surveillance, expensive equipment, systematic documentation of my activities. Marcus, they have pictures of us together. Pack a bag, he said without hesitation. Right now. Don't go to the office. Don't follow your normal routine. Don't contact anyone from your house phone. Meet me at the location we discussed you. Remember where? The safe house was a small apartment Marcus rented under an assumed name, paid for in cash and equipped with basic necessities. As I sat in the unfamiliar space, looking at the photos spread across the small table, the full weight of what we were facing hit me. This isn't just about discrediting advocacy groups, I said. They're willing to use violence. The note about James not being protected, that's a death threat. Marcus nodded grimly. The surveillance photos prove they have the resources and organization of a professional operation. This isn't corporate public relations, this is intelligence-level intimidation. The personal cost was becoming unbearable. I hadn't been able to contact Patricia Wells or the foundation staff. Couldn't return to my normal life. Couldn't even stay in my own home. The investigation that had started with questions about a town hall meeting had evolved into something that threatened my basic safety. Maybe I should stop, I said, the words painful to speak. Maybe they're right that some fights aren't worth the cost. Marcus looked at me with the intensity I'd come to associate with his best investigative instincts. Hannah, think about why they're escalating to threats and surveillance. Think about what that tells us. That they're dangerous and willing to hurt people. That they're desperate, he corrected. Professional surveillance and death threats aren't tactics you use when you're confident in your position. They're tactics you use when you're afraid of what your opponent might discover. The surveillance photos revealed something crucial about our investigation. We were getting close to something that terrified powerful people. The sophisticated intimidation campaign proved that the stakes were higher than policy debates or legislative battles. The leaked DHS memo, the surveillance, the death threats. Someone is investing enormous resources to stop us from asking questions about what happened 29 years ago, Marcus continued. What could victim advocates discover that would justify this level of response? I thought about James's unfinished safety report, about the questions that had haunted me for 3 decades. What if James had uncovered something that connected to current efforts to silence victim families? What if his death hadn't just been collateral damage in a terrorist attack, but a targeted elimination of someone who knew too much? The thought was almost too painful to consider, but the evidence was forcing me toward conclusions I'd avoided for 29 years. The surveillance proved that someone still considered James's investigation dangerous enough to monitor. His widow 3 decades later. Marcus, what if they killed my husband specifically because of what he was investigating? What if the bombing was cover for targeted assassinations? That's exactly what they don't want us to think, he replied. And exactly why they're so desperate to stop us from investigating. That night, alone in the safe house, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I could surrender to the intimidation, accept that some truths were too dangerous to pursue, and live with the knowledge that James's real killers had escaped justice. Or, I could honor the promise I'd made at his funeral. Finish the investigation he'd started, and expose the truth regardless of the personal cost. The surveillance photos were spread across the table like a taunt, proof of how much power they had over my life, but they were also proof of how afraid they were of what I might discover. James had been methodical, thorough, and uncompromising when it came to finding the truth. Now I had to be all those things too, even if it killed me. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning at the Oklahoma City National Memorial. I'd chosen the location deliberately. If they wanted to silence a bombing victim, they'd have to do it in front of the memorial to bombing victims. Marcus had spent 3 days reaching out to journalists, carefully selecting reporters who had the credibility and courage to cover a story this explosive. The major networks sent representatives, along with independent journalists and digital media outlets that weren't beholden to corporate interests. I stood at the podium, looking out at the cameras and microphones, holding the folder that contained everything: the surveillance photos, the leaked DHS memo, the corporate funding documents, James's unfinished safety report. 29 years of grief and investigation had led to this moment. "My name is Hannah Mitchell," I began, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. 29 years ago, my husband James died in this building behind me, killed by a domestic terrorist's bomb. For 3 decades, I've honored his memory by fighting for the workplace safety regulations he died trying to enforce. I paused, looking directly into the cameras. Last month, a city councilman called me anti-government for supporting the same federal safety regulations my husband died protecting. That accusation led me to investigate why victim advocates like me were suddenly being portrayed as threats to national security. The assembled reporters leaned forward as I began revealing the evidence. The surveillance photos drew audible gasps. The DHS memo generated frantic note-taking. The corporate funding documents that traced the attacks back to their sources created a buzz of whispered conversations. For the past 2 years, a coordinated network of corporate-funded organizations has been systematically destroying the credibility of victim advocates across the country. I continued, "Not because we're anti-government, but because we're pro-accountability. Not because we're extremists, but because we're effective." I held up the surveillance photos, the time-stamped evidence of professional monitoring. This is what happens when victim families ask too many questions. This is what happens when bombing survivors refuse to be silent about government failures. The questions from reporters were immediate and pointed. How long had I been under surveillance? Who was behind the intimidation campaign? What did I think they were trying to hide? They're trying to hide the fact that victim advocates have real power to hold institutions accountable, I answered. They're trying to hide the fact that our questions about government performance threaten narratives that protect powerful interests. But the most important question came from Maria Santos, an investigative reporter with the Tribune. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you believe your husband was specifically targeted because of his safety investigation?" The question I'd been avoiding for 29 years hung in the air. I looked toward the memorial behind me, thinking about James's unfinished report, about the safety violations he'd been documenting, about the phone call that never came. "I believe my husband uncovered information that powerful people wanted buried," I said finally. "I believe his investigation threatened interests that had the resources and motivation to silence him, and I believe the same interests are now trying to silence victim families who might ask questions about what our loved ones discovered before they died." The press conference lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, I felt both liberated and terrified. The truth was finally public, but I'd also made myself an even bigger target. Marcus found me afterward, sitting alone in my car in the memorial parking lot. "Hannah, you just declared war on some of the most powerful interests in the country. Are you ready for what comes next?" I thought about the promise I'd made at James's funeral, about the foundation charter that committed us to fighting for accountability, about the other victim advocates who were counting on me to lead this fight. "They've been at war with us for years," I replied. "We just finally decided to fight back." Within hours, the story was spreading across social media and news outlets. #JusticeForJames began trending on Twitter. Other victim advocates started sharing their own stories of intimidation and surveillance. The silence that had protected the conspiracy was finally broken. But I also knew that going public would trigger the most vicious phase of the campaign against me. They'd tried intimidation and threats. Now they would try to destroy me completely, using every weapon at their disposal to discredit my revelations and silence my voice. The war for truth had officially begun. And I was no longer fighting it alone. The attack began within hours of my press conference. By evening, social media was flooded with posts questioning my mental state, my motives, and my right to speak for bombing victims. The coordination was obvious. Identical talking points, appearing simultaneously across dozens of accounts, professional graphics and videos produced too quickly to be organic responses. The hashtag #HannahHoax, began trending, accompanied by posts claiming I was exploiting my husband's death for attention, money, and political influence. Screenshots of Foundation financial documents taken completely out of context. were shared as proof that I was profiting from tragedy, but the most vicious attacks targeted my grief itself. Anonymous accounts posted that I was James's memory, that my conspiracy theories were an insult to bombing victims, that I was mentally unstable from decades of unprocessed trauma. Bombing widow goes off the deep end. Read one viral tweet with 50,000 retweets. Hannah Mitchell's dangerous conspiracy theories dishonor her husband's sacrifice and all bombing victims. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and brutal. They weren't just attacking my credibility, they were weaponizing my trauma against me, using James's death as evidence that I was too damaged to be trusted. Marcus documented the campaign in real time, taking screenshots of the coordinated posts before they could be deleted. "Look at this," he said, showing me the metadata analysis. "These attacks are coming from bot networks and sock puppet accounts, all created within the past 48 hours. Someone spent serious money on this operation." The digital assault was accompanied by a media campaign that portrayed my press conference as the desperate delusions of a grieving widow. News outlets that had covered the foundation respectfully for decades suddenly ran stories questioning my stability and suggesting that victim advocacy work had radicalized me. The Oklahoma Tribune ran a particularly vicious editorial titled, "When Grief Becomes Dangerous," which argued that my conspiracy theories were harmful to other bombing families and undermined legitimate memorial efforts. The editorial was written by a columnist who'd received funding from corporate interests I'd exposed, but that connection wasn't disclosed to readers. Local news stations ran expert interviews with psychologists who'd never met me, discussing how trauma could lead to paranoid thinking and conspiracy ideation. The experts explained that bombing survivors often developed anti-government sentiment as a way of processing their helplessness, making my accusations sound like predictable symptoms rather than documented evidence. The foundation's phones were flooded with angry calls from people who believed the propaganda. Donors canceled their support, citing concerns about the organization's political agenda. Board members received threatening messages demanding they distance themselves from my extremist statements. Patricia Wells called me in tears. "Hannah, I've worked with this foundation for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. They're trying to destroy everything we've built." The attacks weren't limited to social media and news coverage. Someone had filed complaints with the IRS questioning the foundation's tax-exempt status, triggering an audit that would consume resources and attention for months. Anonymous tips to local police claimed I was making terroristic threats and planning violence against government officials. The character assassination was working. Friends who'd supported me for decades began asking concerned questions about my recent behavior. Family members called to express worry about my obsession with conspiracy theories. Even bombing families who'd worked with the foundation for years began distancing themselves from my controversial statements. "They're turning my own community against me," I told Marcus during one of our secure phone calls. "People who've known me for 30 years are questioning whether I've lost my mind." "That's exactly the goal," he replied. "If they can make you look crazy, no one will believe your evidence. If they can isolate you from your support network, you'll be easier to silence." The psychological toll was enormous. I found myself second-guessing decisions, analyzing my own words for signs of the conspiracy thinking my critics described. The constant attacks made me question whether I was being paranoid, whether the evidence I'd gathered was real or imagined. But the surveillance photos were real. The leaked DHS memo was real. The corporate funding documents were real. The coordinated attacks against victim advocates were real. And the viciousness of the backlash proved that someone was desperately afraid of what I'd revealed. Late at night, alone in the safe house, I read through the social media attacks again. The hatred was palpable, the cruelty designed to break my spirit and make me retreat into silence. They were using James's death as a weapon against me, turning my love for him into evidence of my instability. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd attacked other bombing families in their campaign against me, suggesting that anyone who supported my investigation was also mentally unstable. This had awakened something in the survivor community that no amount of propaganda could suppress: the protective instinct of people who'd already lost everything that mattered most. The backlash was designed to silence me, but it was also waking up allies I didn't know I had. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Martinez's teenage daughter, Sophia, who was majoring in computer science at UT Austin, while her mother faced professional attacks for her advocacy work, Sophia had been quietly tracking the digital campaign against victim advocates using techniques she'd learned in her cybersecurity classes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think I found where the money comes from," Sophia said during an encrypted video call. "The bot networks attacking you all trace back to a digital marketing firm called Strategic Communications Solutions. But that's just a shell company." Sophia had spent weeks following the digital breadcrumbs, using blockchain analysis and corporate filing searches to trace the funding behind the attacks. Her youthful energy and technical skills had uncovered connections that older investigators might have missed. Strategic Communications Solutions is owned by Narrative Management LLC, which is owned by Public Affairs Consulting Group, which is ultimately controlled by something called the American Security Initiative, she explained, sharing her screen to show the complex ownership structure. Marcus and I studied Sophia's research with growing excitement. The American Security Initiative wasn't a household name, but it was connected to some of the most powerful corporate and political interests in the country. Board members included former CIA directors, defense contractors, energy company executives, and pharmaceutical industry leaders. "Look at the financial records," Sophia continued, pulling up banking documents she'd obtained through Freedom of Information requests. The American Security Initiative received $47 million in funding last year from corporations that would benefit from the Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act. The money trail was clear. Companies that wanted to eliminate safety regulations had pooled resources to fund a sophisticated campaign against the advocates who would oppose them, but the operation was much larger than we'd initially understood. "They're not just targeting victim advocates," Sophia said, showing us additional research. "They're running similar campaigns against environmental groups, consumer safety organizations, and government watchdog groups. Anyone who threatens corporate profits gets the same treatment." Marcus leaned forward, studying the financial data. "Hannah, this isn't just about safety regulations. This is about creating a template for silencing any opposition to corporate power. They're testing strategies on victim advocates because we're sympathetic targets who wants to attack grieving families." The scope was staggering. The American Security Initiative had funded attacks on climate scientists, consumer advocates, civil rights leaders, and investigative journalists. The campaign against victim advocates was just one front in a broader war against accountability itself. But Sophia had discovered something even more significant. The initiative's internal communications, leaked by a whistleblower who understood the danger of what they were doing. "These emails show they're planning to expand the operation," Sophia said, sharing screenshots of internal messages. "They want to use the techniques they've perfected against victim advocates to target politicians, judges, and journalists who threaten corporate interests." The leaked emails revealed the cold calculation behind the attacks. Victim advocates were described as test subjects for propaganda techniques that would later be used against more prominent targets. Our pain was being weaponized not just to silence us, but to develop tools for silencing democracy itself. One email from the initiative's director was particularly chilling. "The Mitchell Foundation operation has exceeded expectations. Subjects' credibility effectively neutralized despite strong evidentiary basis for claims. Recommends scaling methodology for broader application against institutional opposition." They were treating my destruction as a case study, analyzing which attacks were most effective at discrediting truthful accusations. The surveillance, the character assassination, the weaponization of grief, all of it was being documented and refined for use against future targets. "We need to trace this back to the ultimate source," Marcus said, studying the financial records. "The American Security Initiative is funded by corporations, but who's coordinating the strategy? Who's making the decisions about which advocates to target?" Sophia's research had identified a pattern in the corporate board memberships. The same names appeared on multiple company boards, foundation boards, and government advisory committees. A small network of individuals had enormous influence over both corporate policy and government regulation. "Look at this," she said, highlighting a name that appeared connected to every major company funding the initiative. "Richard Blackwood serves on the boards of 6 companies that would benefit from eliminating safety regulations. He's also on the board of the American Security Initiative and 3 government advisory committees related to domestic security." Richard Blackwood. I'd never heard the name, but according to Sophia's research, he was one of the most powerful unelected officials in Washington. A lawyer who'd moved seamlessly between corporate boards and government positions. accumulating influence and connections that spanned decades. He's the architect, Marcus said, reading through Blackwood's biography. He's spent 30 years building networks that protect corporate interests from government oversight. The campaign against victim advocates is his masterpiece. That night, I stared at Richard Blackwood's photograph on my computer screen. A distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and the confident smile of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. This was the person who'd turned my grief into a weapon, who'd ordered the surveillance and intimidation that had driven me from my home. For 29 years, I'd believed that James died because a domestic terrorist wanted to strike against the federal government. Now I understood that James had died because people like Richard Blackwood needed to eliminate threats to their power, and that the same interests were still killing people, just more subtly. The question now was whether we could prove Blackwood's involvement and expose the network he'd built to silence opposition. Sophia had found the source, but confronting him would require evidence that could survive the most sophisticated attacks on our credibility. It was time to go directly to the source and get that evidence, no matter what it cost. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries, lawyers who represented lawyers who knew people who could get messages to Richard Blackwood. I'd made it clear that I had evidence connecting him to the campaign against victim advocates, and that I was willing to discuss a resolution that didn't involve criminal charges. The bait was irresistible to someone who'd spent decades managing threats through negotiation and intimidation. Blackwood agreed to meet at his private office in a downtown Washington law firm, confident that he could handle one grieving widow who'd gotten in over her head. I arrived wearing a wire provided by Marcus, a tiny recording device hidden beneath my jacket. If Blackwood admitted to anything incriminating, we'd have proof that could expose the entire network. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. after business hours, ensuring privacy for our conversation. Blackwood's office was everything I'd expected: leather-bound law books, expensive art, photographs with presidents and cabinet members spanning for decades. He greeted me with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Mrs. Mitchell, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his mahogany desk. "I understand you have concerns about some recent media coverage of your foundation's work, Mr. Blackwood. I have evidence that you've orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy victim advocacy organizations across the country," I said, setting a folder on his desk. "The surveillance, the character assassination, the corporate funding, it all traces back to networks you control." His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "That's quite an accusation, Mrs. Mitchell. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims." The American Security Initiative, Strategic Communications Solutions, the bot networks attacking advocates on social media, your fingerprints are on all of it, I continued. "The question is whether you're willing to discuss ending these attacks in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying me with the patience of a predator who knew he held every advantage. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you misunderstand the situation you're in. You're not here to threaten me, you're here because I allowed you to be here." The mask was dropping, revealing the cold calculation beneath his professional demeanor. "Your investigation has been monitored from the beginning. Every move you've made, every ally you've contacted, every piece of evidence you've gathered, we've known about it all. Then you know I have enough evidence to expose your entire operation. Evidence that would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a traumatized bombing victim," he replied smoothly. "Evidence that would disappear into legal challenges and procedural delays while your credibility is systematically destroyed." Blackwood stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Washington skyline. "You've caused us significant inconvenience, Mrs. Mitchell. The media attention, the questions from congressional staff, the need to accelerate certain legislative priorities, all very expensive problems. Problems you created by attacking victim families, problems we solved by protecting important interests from misguided interference," he corrected. "Your husband was investigating construction companies that employ thousands of people, that contribute billions to the economy. His safety obsession threatened jobs and economic growth." My blood froze. "You knew about James's investigation before he died." Blackwood turned from the window, and for the first time, I saw the true ruthlessness in his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband was documenting safety violations that could have cost our clients hundreds of millions in compliance costs and legal liability. His report threatened strategic economic interests. You had him killed. I had a problem solved, he said, the words as casual as discussing the weather. The bombing provided convenient cover for eliminating several problematic federal employees. Your husband was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, investigating the wrong companies. The recording device beneath my jacket was capturing every word, but I felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was confessing. James hadn't died because of Timothy McVeigh's hatred of government. He'd died because corporate interests needed him silenced. The other victims, the children in the daycare you killed innocent people to cover up murdering federal investigators. Collateral damage, Blackwood replied. Regrettable, but necessary to maintain plausible deniability. A targeted assassination would have raised questions. A terrorist attack eliminated the questions along with the targets. I forced myself to keep him talking, to get everything on record. And now you're trying to silence victim families who might ask the wrong questions. Now we're preventing history from repeating itself, he said, returning to his chair. The 30th anniversary could have generated unwelcome scrutiny of the official narrative. Better to discredit potential troublemakers before they could cause problems. Blackwood opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file with my name on it. 30 years of surveillance, Mrs. Mitchell. Every phone call, every email, every meeting with other advocates. We've been watching you since the day of your husband's funeral, waiting to see if you'd become a problem that needed solving, like James was a problem that needed solving. Exactly like that, he confirmed. But you forced our hand by going public. The media attention, the congressional questions, the scrutiny of our funding sources, all very inconvenient complications. Blackwood leaned forward, his voice taking on a threatening tone. So here's what's going to happen, Mrs. Mitchell. You're going to recant your accusations, apologize for spreading conspiracy theories, and retire quietly from advocacy work. The foundation will be dissolved. The other advocates will be discredited, and this unfortunate episode will be forgotten. And if I refuse, then you'll join your husband, he said simply. Another tragic victim of domestic terrorism, killed by extremists who were inspired by your own anti-government rhetoric. The irony will be noted in your obituary. I stood up, my legs unsteady but my voice firm. Mr. Blackwood, this entire conversation has been recorded. Every admission, every threat, every confession about my husband's murder, it's all being transmitted to journalists and law enforcement as we speak. His face went white as I revealed the wire beneath my jacket. You have 30 seconds to call off your attacks on victim advocates before this recording goes public and destroys everything you've built. For the first time in our conversation, Richard Blackwood looked afraid. The recording of Richard Blackwood's confession hit the internet at exactly 7 p.m. Eastern Time, simultaneously released by Marcus Weber's newspaper, 3 independent journalists, and a network of victim advocates who'd been waiting for this moment. Within minutes, the audio was spreading across social media faster than any attempt to suppress it. Blackwood's cold admission that James had been murdered to protect corporate interests exploded across news outlets. His casual description of using the Oklahoma City bombing as convenient cover for targeted assassinations dominated headlines. His threat to kill me like your husband became the soundbite that ended his 30-year career of operating in the shadows. The FBI arrested Blackwood at his office within 2 hours of the recording's release. Federal prosecutors, suddenly faced with evidence of a conspiracy that made their careers possible, moved with unprecedented speed to file charges of conspiracy to commit murder, domestic terrorism, and racketeering. But the recording did more than destroy one man. It vindicated everything I'd claimed about the systematic attacks on victim advocates, the corporate funding documents, the surveillance evidence, the coordinated character assassination campaigns. All of it was suddenly understood as part of a criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate political opposition. Congressional hearings began within a week. The Senate Judiciary Committee, the House Oversight Committee, and a special joint committee on domestic terrorism all launched investigations into what media outlets were calling the Blackwood conspiracy. Victim advocates who'd been discredited and marginalized were suddenly star witnesses with stories that needed to be heard. Dr. Patricia Evans testified about years of surveillance and intimidation. Michael Chen described how his Mind Safety Foundation had been systematically undermined. Sarah Williams revealed how bombing families had been monitored and manipulated for decades. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. The American Security Initiative was raided by federal agents, its files seized, and its funding sources exposed. The shell companies that had funded the attacks were dissolved, their bank accounts frozen. The corporate executives who'd funded Blackwood's operation faced criminal charges and civil lawsuits from the advocates they'd targeted. But the most satisfying vindication came from the institutions that had participated in discrediting me. The Oklahoma Tribune published a front-page apology, admitting that their editorial attacking me had been based on information provided by Blackwood's network. The city councilman who'd called me anti-government resigned in disgrace after evidence emerged of payments from corporate lobbyists. The foundation's phones, which had been flooded with angry calls after my press conference, now rang constantly with apologies and offers of support. Donors who'd canceled their contributions sent larger donations along with notes expressing shame for doubting my credibility. Board members who distanced themselves from my controversial statements publicly apologized for their lack of courage. 3 months after Blackwood's arrest, I stood before Congress to testify about the conspiracy that had shaped my life for 30 years. The same lawmakers who might have dismissed my claims as conspiracy theories before the recording now listened with respectful attention as I described how corporate interests had weaponized tragedy for profit. For 29 years, I believed my husband died because a domestic terrorist hated the federal government, I told the packed hearing room. Now I know he died because corporate interests needed to silence federal investigators who threatened their profits. The bombing wasn't just an attack on government, it was a cover story for targeted assassinations. The court documents filed in federal court officially vindicated my investigation. United States v. Richard Blackwood, ETL, became the most significant domestic terrorism prosecution in decades, not because of the bombing itself, but because of the systematic conspiracy to silence those who might ask questions about it. The Federal Safety Oversight Reform Act, which had been moving quietly through Congress, was withdrawn within days of Blackwood's arrest. The corporate interests that had funded its passage suddenly faced federal investigation rather than regulatory relief. The safety regulations James had died protecting were not only preserved, but strengthened. 6 months after the recordings release, I received a call from the White House. The president wanted to personally apologize for the government's failure to protect federal employees like James and to announce new protections for whistleblowers and victim advocates. The call came on April 19, the 30th anniversary of the bombing. Mrs. Mitchell, your courage in exposing this conspiracy has served the cause of justice and honored your husband's memory, the president said. The nation owes you a debt of gratitude for refusing to be silenced. That afternoon, I stood at James's grave for the first time since going into hiding. The media circus had died down, the threats had ended, and I could finally mourn my husband without wondering if his killers were still free. The headstone was simple. James Mitchell, Federal Safety Inspector, died April 19, 1995, in service to his country. But now those words carried new meaning. James hadn't died as collateral damage in someone else's political statement. He'd died as a targeted victim of the interests he'd spent his career fighting. The Foundation's work could continue now, but with a broader mission. We weren't just advocating for safety regulations, we were protecting the democratic institutions that made advocacy possible. The conspiracy that killed James had been exposed, but the conditions that made such conspiracies possible still existed. Standing at his grave, I made a new promise to ensure that no other victim families would face what we'd endured, and that no other advocates would be silenced for telling inconvenient truths about power. 1 year after Richard Blackwood's confession, I stood in the Rose Garden as the president signed the James Mitchell Federal Employee Protection Act into law. The legislation, named after my husband, created new safeguards for federal investigators and whistleblowers, ensuring that what happened to James could never happen again. In my hands, I held the medal that should have been presented 30 years ago, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded posthumously to James for his service and sacrifice. The medal was beautiful, but what mattered more was what it represented: visual recognition that James had died serving his country, not just caught in someone else's attack on it. James Mitchell exemplified the highest ideals of public service, the president said during the ceremony. His investigation into workplace safety violations demonstrated the courage and integrity that we must protect in all federal employees. This medal honors not just his memory, but the principle that truth-telling in service of public safety is the highest form of patriotism. The foundation had been transformed by the events of the past year. What had started as a small advocacy group for bombing families had become a national watchdog organization protecting victim advocates and government whistleblowers from the kind of attacks we'd endured. Our budget had grown to $15 million annually, funded by supporters who understood that protecting democracy required protecting those who held power accountable. Patricia Wells had been promoted to executive director, overseeing a staff of 40 people working on advocacy protection, surveillance detection, and rapid response to corporate intimidation campaigns. Sofia Martinez had graduated early and joined us as Director of Digital Security, using her technical skills to protect advocates from the kind of digital warfare we'd faced. The network of victim advocates that had emerged from our shared ordeal continued to meet monthly. Now, as the Coalition for Advocacy Protection rather than a support group for targeted individuals, Dr. Patricia Evans had established a legal defense fund for advocates facing frivolous lawsuits. Michael Chen created a secure communications system that allowed advocates to share information without fear of surveillance. But the most important change was in how we understood our role. We weren't just advocating for specific policies anymore, we were defending the right to advocate at all. The Blackwood conspiracy had shown us that effective advocacy itself was under attack, that the ability to hold power accountable was being systematically eliminated. The Foundation's new mission statement, unanimously approved by our board, reflected this broader understanding: to protect the democratic right of victims and advocates to seek truth, demand accountability, and hold powerful interests responsible for their actions, without fear of intimidation, surveillance, or retaliation. James's unfinished safety report now sat in a place of honor in our expanded offices, but it was no longer a symbol of work left undone. His investigation had been completed, his killers brought to justice, his sacrifice given meaning through the protections we'd built for future investigators. On quiet evenings, I sometimes reread the report that had started everything. James's careful documentation of safety violations, his methodical approach to protecting workers, his unwavering commitment to doing the right thing regardless of powerful opposition. These qualities had made him dangerous to people like Blackwood, and they'd ultimately led to his murder. But they'd also made him a hero worth honoring. The safety regulations he'd died protecting were stronger now than ever. The workers he'd tried to protect were safer because of laws passed in his memory. The federal investigators he'd represented had new protections against the kind of retaliation he'd faced. The Foundation's work continued, but with a different energy. We weren't just grieving families asking for justice anymore. We were experienced advocates with the knowledge and resources to protect others from what we'd endured. Every corporate intimidation campaign we exposed made the next one less likely to succeed. Every whistleblower we protected inspired others to come forward with their own evidence of wrongdoing. Marcus Weber had won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation of the Blackwood conspiracy, but more importantly, his work had established new standards for reporting on corporate influence and government accountability. Newsrooms across the country now had protocols for protecting sources who exposed coordinated attacks on advocacy groups. 6 months ago, I'd received a letter from a young federal inspector in Texas who'd discovered safety violations at a chemical plant. Her superiors were pressuring her to ignore the violations, and corporate lawyers were threatening her job if she pursued the investigation. Instead of facing that pressure alone, she'd contacted the Foundation for support. We'd connected her with legal representation, media protection, and a network of experienced advocates who could guide her through the process of exposing corporate wrongdoing safely. Her investigation led to criminal charges against the chemical company and new safety regulations that protected thousands of workers. That's what James would have wanted. Not just justice for his death, but protection for the investigators who continued his work. Not just accountability for past wrongs, but prevention of future victims. Standing in my office, looking at James's posthumous Medal of Freedom displayed next to his safety inspector badge, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years: peace. The questions that had haunted me were answered. The conspiracy that killed him was exposed. The work he'd started was protected and ongoing. James Mitchell had died trying to protect people from corporate negligence and government failures. Now his legacy was protecting people who tried to protect others. The Foundation bearing his name ensured that truth-tellers and accountability advocates would never again face the kind of systematic destruction we'd endured. It wasn't the ending. I'd wanted nothing could bring James back or restore the 30 years we'd lost. But it was the ending James would have chosen. A world where federal investigators could do their jobs without fear, where victim advocates could seek justice without retaliation, and where telling the truth about powerful interests was protected rather than punished. The promise I'd made at his funeral was finally kept. James's work was finished, and his legacy was secure.